From October 7th to November the 1st, the voices critical of Israel growing louder by the day. Case in point, the Americas, after Bolivia became the first nation to sever ties, Chile and Colombia recalling ambassadors on Tuesday. The Israelis may claim that their bombings of the Jabaliya refugee camp were to target and kill a senior Hamas commander. Was it worth the lives of dozens of civilians, including women and children? Make no mistake, Latin American nations overwhelmingly condemn the Hamas slaughter of civilians. At least 15 Argentinians are listed as hostages today. But the slow rollout of the ground offensive and the trickle of aid going into a blockaded Gaza have provoked sharp reactions. And like in France and the UK, the war in the Middle East is splitting apart the left in the United States. Enough to scar the Democratic Party as it heads into an election cycle? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Israel and the Americas. Joining with us from Tel Aviv, Raanan Rine, professor of Latin American history, vice president of Tel Aviv University. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Just a small correction, former vice president of Tel Aviv University.
Former vice president, but thank you so much for that correction. Apologies. Joining us from Bogota, she used to hang her hat in the Middle East, Elizabeth Dickinson, senior analyst at Crisis Group. Thanks for being with us.
Really a pleasure. Thank you.
And we're joined here in the studio by political philosophy professor Lex Paulsen, executive director at Mohammed VI Polytechnic University's School of Collective Intelligence. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on the hashtag F24debate. Yeah, La Paz's left-wing government saying the last straw was the bombing of the Gaza Strip's largest refugee camp.
With our principled position of respect for life in mind, we have decided to break diplomatic relations with the State of Israel in condemnation of the aggressive and disproportionate military offensive being carried out in the Gaza Strip and its threat to the international peace and security.
And that announcement coming before a second day of strikes at the Jabaliya camp outside Gaza City. Already Israel's foreign minister responding that the severing of diplomatic ties with Bolivia, by Bolivia rather, is, quote, surrender to terrorism and to the Ayatollah's regime in Iran, end quote. By the way, it's not just Bolivia. Chile didn't sever ties with Israel, but has recalled its ambassador. The country's left-wing president, Gabriel Boric, taking to the social media that used to be called Twitter. And so did Colombia's Gustavo Petro, who also put out a tweet saying, if Israel does not stop the massacre of the Palestinian people, we cannot stay there. Tell us where you're sitting in Bogota, Elizabeth Dickinson. How's the mood shifted since October the 7th?
Well, I think what has become clear in Colombia's reaction is that although there was initial condemnation, of course, of the Hamas attack, the position of the Colombian government is a two-state solution. And what we've seen unfolding in the Gaza Strip, for the Colombian government, at least, is not consistent with that outcome. And President Petro has been very outspoken. He's come out numerous times on Twitter using very specific language about massacres. And I think that this is a reflection of the need to uphold international humanitarian law, which is an echoing call that we're now hearing across the region in Latin America.
We're pleased, by the way, to be joined from Boston by Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez, lecturer at Northwestern University. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Thank you, Francois.
I wanted to ask you, when you look at the state of play, again, it's November the 1st now, and the reactions from the Americas, are they playing out the way you expected?
So, yes, there's a few surprises, but I think that there's that old saying by Ortega y Gasset about how everybody is themselves and their circumstances. And I think that goes probably triply for politicians. And maybe 5 or 6 times for Latin American politicians. What we're seeing essentially is there's certain countries that it makes a lot of sense to focus on affairs to right now. That's mostly because there's rough domestic news in country. And then there's the old ideological divides that have.
Yeah, I was going to ask you: is this left versus right, or is it less straightforward?
It's less straightforward. For example, Argentina has a leftist president right now, but it also has a large Jewish community, experience with anti-Semitism and terror attacks against Jewish victims in country, which makes it a very sort of particular, specific point in Argentina. But also, you have two people running for president right now, one is from sort of the center left, but needs to tack right to win. And the other one is trying to win by going as right as possible. So there's domestic reasons why Argentina, despite being a leftist government right now, has been, quite supportive of Israel up to this point. At the same time, you have, governments like Colombia, which was already mentioned, in which, Petro just lost by much more than had been thought would take place, some regional elections, including having his candidate place third in Bogota. It's tougher to find positive things to say domestically on the Twitter accounts, which I think is in part one of the reasons that we're seeing such vocal moves now. And similar scenarios can be drawn with a lot of the more vocal countries. So I think that there's, domestic reasons why countries are becoming more or less involved. And they can do so in part on the privilege that in Latin America, you don't have a lot of weight geopolitically. So you can play to a domestic audience much more.
There are, of course, Ryan, as we were saying at the outset, Argentinians, but also Colombians, Brazilians who are thought to be held by Hamas, just as there are a lot of people in Latin America of Palestinian descent. And do you agree with what you just heard from Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, that it's a mostly left versus right divide, but not entirely?
Yes, I tend to agree with Daniel, but let's zoom out for a second and say that so far Israel has enjoyed more international support than in any previous military operation in Gaza. And this is precisely because of the massacre of October 7th committed by the terrorists of the Hamas. We do need to look at case by case. You mentioned Bolivia at the beginning of this conversation. In fact, Bolivia already cut diplomatic ties or severe diplomatic ties with Israel already in 2008 under Evo Morales. It resumed diplomatic relations with Israel in 2019 under a right-wing government. Now again, under the influence of Evo Morales, it decided to sever diplomatic ties. And then, in fact, there are no ambassadors in La Paz or in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. So I wouldn't get too excited about this decision. At the same time, I wouldn't get too excited about, for example, the Guatemalan foreign minister pronouncing a very supportive talk about Israel and the support of Guatemala.
But let me ask you about this, about Bolivia here. When the Israeli foreign ministry uses language like you're surrendering, quote, to terrorism and to the Ayatollah's regime in Iran, very undiplomatic language, is that standard fair?
Look, I'm certainly unhappy with the language used by the Israeli foreign ministry. I have additional criticism of the current Israeli government. But in the case of Bolivia, it was the usual suspect. Nobody expected Bolivia to react in a different way. It has to do with regional and international alliances. Bolivia and Venezuela are coordinating their international policies. Venezuela has very strong ties with Iran. They also, both countries look at Russia, and the current Russian president is very hostile towards Israel. So one has to look at domestic politics, at regional alliances, but also at the kind of Cold War that we are witnessing in the international scene. Nobody would be surprised if Nicaragua, for example, would follow Bolivia and also declare that it severs diplomatic ties with Israel. So you have the usual suspects. The main issue has to do with the larger, in a way, more important, quote unquote, countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. And here, indeed, with any day, it's going to become more and more difficult for Israel. Yes, undoubtedly.
Well, Elizabeth Dickinson.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to put two things on the table that I think are important to remember when we're thinking about this in Latin America. And the first one is that, this is a region, and Colombia is one of these countries, but it's not the only one. Also, Venezuela, Mexico, that has a significant diaspora of Palestinians, but also a significant Jewish community. So these are not straightforward decisions for political leaders. And I guess I would push back a little bit on the idea that it's only a domestic political decision. In the case of Colombia, for example, there are actually direct risks and repercussions to the decision that's been taken. First, a risk in terms of Colombia's very important relationship with the United States. But secondly, Israel has sort of counter-announced that it will cease military cooperation with Colombia as a result of their decision. And that although there is no sort of military aid from Israel to Colombia, there is significant cooperation, significant numbers of training. There are aircraft that are only maintenanced here by Israelis. So I think going out on a limb to make this decision, we can't simply attribute it to the idea that we need a political distraction at home. In fact, this is a very risky decision, and I think it needs to be taken in the context of a broader debate internationally about international humanitarian law and what is Latin Americans' emerging role in raising awareness about this. We see this interesting coalition emerging of leftist leaders, Colombia, Chile, Bolivia, that are both on the left, but also willing to hold to account other leaders on issues of human rights.
Point taken, Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez?
So I agree with a lot of what you said, but I think that there's a difference in premise. I do think that it is in Colombia's, that Colombia as a country is potentially sacrificing a lot. But in an age of Twitter and social media, I think that the extent to which the priorities for a president or the particular incentives for a president can diverge from maybe the national interest have only grown. And I think we've seen this because in a lot of cases, because there've been a lot of presidential statements that have been made over social media that then say the Brazilian embassy in Israel has to walk back, or even the Colombian embassy in Israel has had to walk back. So it's actually been something that has probably strained the traditional diplomatic element within the country because of the opinions that are being shared by the various presidents. So I think that it's dangerous to conflate the two because they don't necessarily overlap entirely.
Lex Paulson, how much of what you heard from the international community is a principled position and how much of it is playing to the gallery?
Well, I think there's a little bit of an irony here that the further you are away from the facts on the ground, the more lucid sometimes you can be into considerations of human rights, but also the further you are away from knowing what's going on. And there's certainly a lot of fog of war, and it's made worse by social media. It's made worse by the changes to the Twitter algorithm that have allowed, and the reductions in staff that have allowed the diffusion of patently fake information about what's happening on the ground. And so on the one hand, those of us who are very distant from the region owe it to provide this kind of moral lens on what's happening, but we're doing it based on facts that are often very dubious. And so I think that will affect diplomacy as well as all of the considerations that my colleagues have voiced.
And we talk about the big players in the Americas. And of course, the biggest one for South America is Brazil, whose president reminded the world of his country's strong condemnation of Hamas's October 7th massacre of civilians before last week denouncing the response.
What we have is the insanity of the Prime Minister of Israel, wanting to end the Gaza Strip, forgetting that there are not just Hamas soldiers there, there are women there, and there are children who are the great victims of this war.
So, Ranan Ryan, we've been discussing on this show nightly since October 7th what's going on, the mind frame of Israelis who are scared and feel an existential threat. But do words of leaders like Lula matter at this point?
I think to some extent, yes. And indeed, many of us Israelis share the same criticism about the current Prime Minister Netanyahu. He has part of the responsibility for the current conflict. For very many years, Netanyahu preferred to strengthen the Hamas in order to weaken the Palestinian Authority, hoping to avoid any dialogue or negotiation with the Palestinians and avoiding the need to even consider the possibility of a political solution to the conflict. So the criticism of Netanyahu is certainly justified by many within and without Israel. Brazil matters more than either Bolivia or Guatemala for Israel, yes, but it seems that at the moment, the most important issue is the backing of the current American administration and the military need to continue striking in Gaza. Look, many of us feel extremely uncomfortable when we see the images from Gaza. At the same time, when we hear leaders of the Hamas saying that we would try to repeat the same massacre of October 7th again and again, we tell ourselves, okay, we certainly dislike Netanyahu. We want to see Netanyahu out of power as soon as possible, today, if not tomorrow. But at the same time, that's an enemy that Israel has to fight in one way or another.
Yeah, well, we've seen as well. Let's talk about the United States for a moment. Joe Biden's administration, who came out quick to back Israel after the shock of October the 7th, but have been dialing up calls for Israel to spare civilians, not to, using the U.S. president's words, quote, throw fuel on the fire by continuing to chase Palestinians from their homes in the West Bank. They issued another reminder of that in the past hours. For critics, though, it's too little too late. Yinka Oyetade has more.
Not in the face of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Not in the face of an intensifying strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific.
This was the moment a pro-Palestine protester interrupted a U.S. Senate hearing over aid for Israel. It would be the first of several disruptions before police dragged protesters out of the room one after the other. Meanwhile, a group of demonstrators held red-stained hands in the air, arguing the Biden administration has blood on its hands for backing Israel in the conflict. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Washington must support its allies.
I also hear very much the passions expressed in this room and outside this room. All of us are committed to the protection of civilian life, but all of us know the imperative of standing up with our allies and partners when their security, when their democracies are threatened.
The government is on a quest to secure even more support for Israel. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin both testifying before the Senate's Appropriations Committee to get President Biden's request for a $106 billion military aid package approved. $14.3 billion of which will go to Israel, while over $60 billion will be used to support Ukraine. This while an appetite to continue funding Kyiv's war effort decreases in some parts of the Republican Party. Officials warn that aid for Ukraine must not end.
Putin is very much trying to take advantage of the Hamas attack on Israel in the hopes that it will distract us. And at the same time, he's allied with the exact elements that are trying to wreak havoc in Israel.
Hamas receives funding and weapons from Iran, a country that is closely aligned with the Kremlin. It's provided thousands of suicide drones for Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Now, there's been a whole heap of resentment towards the United States since Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, saying it's great that the U.S. is devoting so much money and effort on this. Why don't they do the same for for the Palestinians or for those that are being oppressed elsewhere in the world. Is that coming home to roost right now, Lex Paulsen?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there's no one in the world who doubts that if Joe Biden and the American government wanted to stop this massacre of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, that they could do so. The problem is that America has committed to a position that Israel has the right to defend itself and is not putting any kind of overt pressure as to where that red line would be. They've expressed concern for civilian life. They've expressed the need to respect the laws of war. They've even said and evoked 9/11 to say that America learned not to react emotionally, that it's not in the strategic interest of a country to commit to irreversible policies in the wake of an emotionally traumatizing disaster. But we don't know exactly what is going on behind the scenes, but we do know that what's going on behind the scenes has not stopped the rockets that have now killed thousands of innocent children in Gaza.
Ryan, so there's the thinking that the U.S. administration, by going all in at the beginning, sending those aircraft carriers, committing ammunition, that they were buying themselves influence to be able to rein in some of Israel's feeling of rage and revenge that could lead to what Lex Paulsen was describing. How has that worked?
I think that the U.S. has succeeded in restraining the current Israeli government. I think that the original invasion plan of Israel was changed under the dictation of the U.S. I think that the current Israeli government is willing to allow the entry of supplies, humanitarian supplies to Gaza under the pressure of the U.S. The U.S. is very much involved in each and every aspect of the current war, and therefore it would have to wait for historians to judge. I think that so far they have been playing a tremendously positive role in the course of the war.
Domestically, is it tenable? Elizabeth Dickinson, let me begin with you on this, because we're facing the prospect of a long war. Again, the Jabaliya refugee camp bombed for a second day this Wednesday. Is the U.S.'s position when they say things like, don't throw fuel in the fire by when it comes to the West Bank settlers who've been kicking Palestinians off their land, are they getting any credit for that?
Well, I think it's not an accident that the statements that we've seen from Latin America have come immediately before these leaders will be in Washington, including meeting with President Biden. So I think the role of the United States in influencing Israel's behavior is clear. It's certainly clear here domestically that this is the area where Latin America can push. Can Latin America change Israel's opinion? Almost certainly not. But can it make a dent in White House thinking? Maybe. This is a relationship that's been renegotiated, let's say, over the last few years. When Washington calls Bogota, they don't always get everything they want the way they might have a decade ago. And now this is another card that's on the table. I think, the other important point here is that, across Latin America, really, Israel has not had a public opinion problem. This is a region that has broadly supported Israel for decades. And I think what is among the unfortunate repercussions of all of this is that has now been drawn back by years, a setback in terms of the sort of acceptance of Israel. And obviously that has implications here nationally as well in terms of rises in anti-Semitism. As sort of the second and third order effects of everything that's happening, I think, go far beyond what we can sort of imagine at the current moment.
And what's the way to dial that back?
I think that the first step, and Crisis Group has called for this across the board, is to get a ceasefire in Gaza. This is clearly a situation that is jeopardizing the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians. And that's the call from Latin America. And I think it would go a long way towards reestablishing the ability to create those diplomatic relationships, and certainly would also help in the relationship between the United States and Latin America, which will be also strained by what's happening in the Middle East.
Where you're sitting in Boston, Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez, how would a call for a ceasefire sit?
Well, I'd like to push back a little bit on the idea that Israel and Latin America have always had really great relations up until these recent events. That's simply not the case. Speaking as a Venezuelan, I remember at least a half dozen times in which relations were cut, in which ambassadors were kicked out, not just in Venezuela, but in the entire ALBA group, in various parts of Latin America, 2014, the late 2000s, almost every time that there is conflict in the region. I would say that the instinct has certainly not been particularly pro-Israeli. So I think that the geopolitics have a lot to do with it, but they don't have everything to do with it. And I think that most Latin American countries have sort of bigger things on their plate right now. I think that the optics are good for a lot of leaders, but right now is a really bad time to be a president in Latin America. You can't get anything done. Congresses are running the place. Presidents are getting impeached. They're not getting reelected. This is a particularly weak moment for executives across the board. I don't think that they're going to be particularly dynamic or press particularly hard beyond sort of a narrow window of self-interest. And I think we can see that, the weakening of the geopolitical argument and the identity one for that matter. I think we can see with the president who has arguably been most supportive of Israel, who's also the only Palestinian president in the region, ethnically, which is Bukele in El Salvador, who has, is close to Putin, is not close to the Biden administration, and has, voiced very strong support. There's other aspects that come in as well. Have you had a history of terrorism or of armed insurrection in your country? So I think the idea of painting Latin America with one brush, imagining a situation in which, lots of Latin American countries would sit together and push on the U.S., I think that's...
But the question is about the U.S.'s position itself. Is it tenable going forward if in its own backyard there's more and more pushback?
So yes, I think that what's happening right now geopolitically that's most interesting is essentially, you have a rise of Chinese influence. Now, China has not been particularly strong on either side in this. And I think that's one of the reasons that Brazil hasn't either, because Brazil might be in South America, but it identifies as BRIC, sort of above all. And I think that, there's some corners that see this as a potential opportunity for the BRICS to be able to play a part in a ceasefire or in the peace. But I think that very few countries would follow the U.S.'s lead blindly. I think that has changed. But that's changed in part because the sort of time structure, the long-term incentive is not something that I think very many Latin American leaders are being guided by right now. Because the domestic scenarios have changed so much.
Yeah, we talk about domestic scenarios, and whenever the Middle East erupts, it impacts domestic scenarios the world over. We've talked about on this show how it's been bitter in France, in the UK. It's been a bitter 3.5 weeks on U.S. college campuses, with pro-Israel donors threatening to divest over pro-Palestinian protests, and anger over some students ripping up posters of the hostages held by Hamas at New York University. It was reported last week that 2 students faced a disciplinary action if they were posted on Twitter, taking down those posters of hostages. Lex Paulsen, this kind of polarization that sweeps campuses, we've seen it in the past many a time. Is this like some kind of the worst you've seen in a long time or the worst you've seen ever?
Maybe ever. I mean, in my lifetime, I was on campus 25 years ago, and I remember being being educated about world events as they were happening and being, in a sense, reacting to them before I was really that well informed. And I think a lot of these students, 19, 20 years old, they haven't visited the region. What they do is they filter news about world events through political tribal affiliations. And so if you are on the side of decolonialization and your peers say, Israel is evil, then you filter events through a notion in which Israel is the bad actor, no matter how many Israelis died on October 7th. In contrast, if you are reflexively pro-Israel, as many on the right and even many Democratic elected officials are, you filter events through this idea that what Israel always needs to do is get tougher and get tougher and get tougher. And I think it's true for adults as well as young people, but I think young people are the ones who, as we've seen in recent weeks, have been paying the price directly by being doxxed by the treatment of those Harvard students, having their faces put on the side of a truck. This is not, I think, an appropriate reaction to letters from students. And frankly, I think these letters from students are not representative of what young people across America think about whether it's right to kill innocent people.
Yeah, and of course, what's different is what's different the fact that we're in the digital age. Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, everything is filmed, and so it doesn't even stay on campus. It goes around the world.
I think that's exactly right, Francois. I think one of the biggest changes that I've seen in teaching for 10 years. And sort of the sort of psychological shift between people who are maybe younger millennials to Gen Z is that people who grew up around social media have a sort of inherent understanding that any mistake you make, anything you say can be used against you forever. Because you cannot control how long it will be able to haunt you for. And I think that's a very different mentality than people who are older and who are, the demographic that's in charge now view things. And I think that that's something that colors things as well. And I think that this generational divide is something that's not only occurring in campuses. We see it all across the world, including in places like Saudi Arabia, where you had sort of a younger group that was pushing for normalization of relations with Israel prior to this, to the terrorist attacks. And then an older generation who still, was very firmly committed to the Palestinian cause. I'd say that in the U.S., that dynamic is inversed a little bit among Gen Xers and baby boomers. Who may see things through a little bit less of a colonial lens, but also who view, the idea of an existential threat, I think, a little bit differently. I think that is a very different conversation, and one that is, the demographics play towards, probably a weakening of support for Israel over time. And I think that that's something that should be a strong incentive for the region and for the leadership. In as much as any government or group is capable of long-term thinking right now.
Elizabeth Dickinson, you agree?
Yeah, I think that, that there definitely is a generational aspect to it here. And I think that it's really important to remember that these images resonate a lot. In a country like Colombia, where I am, the history of conflict and the extent to which debate about international humanitarian law, protection of civilians is a part of the daily conversation here in terms of the active conflict that we're still continuing to live here in Colombia. So seeing, I think, these very, very graphic and very pronounced images from Gaza really resonates with a society that has lived through an experience of armed conflict and continues to search for peace here in Colombia. And I think, of course, President Petro would, I think, like to position himself as someone who can do that on a global level as well. Now, whether he'll be successful is another question. But just to say that I think, these images hit home in a way that transcends sort of just interaction with regular social media. This is something that I think there's a direct relationship to because of the experience of conflict.
Yeah, and getting back to the United States, what we are seeing is the images are going both ways. What we've every day a stream of images, often unfiltered, coming from the region. In initial polls conducted after October 7th, Americans solidly siding with Israel. The numbers have been going down. And what's interesting is to note in a poll conducted in the last few days among Arab Americans, only 17% now support the incumbent president, Joe Biden. The support for Biden was at 59% in 2020. It fell before the outbreak of violence in the Middle East to 35%. And has halved since. We're down to 17%. Lex Paulsen, we know where Donald Trump stands when it comes to Israel. So does Joe Biden have a problem? Is it going to be like during the Vietnam War where the Democratic Party tore itself apart?
Well, I mean, the Arab American vote is critical in one state, but several states, but in one state above others, in the state of Michigan, which was one of 3 states that was responsible for Hillary Clinton losing in 2016 and for Joe Biden winning in 2020. Joe Biden has to take this very, very seriously. There are several 100,000 Arab American voters in the state of Michigan alone. So I think he will regret and his administration will regret characterizing the positions of those who have called for the ceasefire as repugnant, as Karine Jean-Pierre did the other day. I think this president, this government, will be reckoning with the, I think, very, very mishandled response to some of those from Arab Americans who have experienced, as Jewish Americans have, a rise in hate crimes. There's a rise in Islamophobia as well as anti-Semitism. And Biden is very naturally empathetic, but I think his government, in several instances, especially through the spokespeople, have diminished or sought to delegitimize criticisms of Israel, which I think are very valid ones.
So listening to this, Ron Rain, when you see that the United States, you told us earlier in the conversation how they've been able to partially rein in Israel's initial plans when it comes to how to respond. Now, Israel's talking about it being a long war. When you hear what Lex Paulsen just said in the buildup, again, to that presidential campaign, what's your thought?
My impression is that the Biden administration is already putting pressure on Israel to agree to start one kind or another of dialogue with the Palestinian Authority. I think that from day one, the Americans have been putting pressure on Israel to think about the day after. And it might have some positive result in the form of a new regional negotiation about some kind of a political solution. I think that Israel at the moment depends so much on the US, on the American administration, that it would be very hard for even the extreme right-wing government of Netanyahu say no to the U.S. When it comes to relations with the Palestinian Authority. And after all, Hamas is an enemy of the Palestinian Authority as much as it is an enemy of Israel.
But he's not reining in those West Bank settlers. That could be something easy that he could do to help win back some of that sympathy.
You are absolutely right. I do hope that they put more pressure on the Israeli government. What's going on in the West Bank is simply appalling, and many of us Israelis are simply desperate when we see the way Jewish settlers are behaving in the West Bank.
Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez, your thoughts as the United States heads into a presidential campaign. How much will this issue hurt Joe Biden as things stand now?
Well, I think that it's going to depend a lot on how things play out over coming months. Joe Biden, I think, has he came down very strong from the outset, and in doing so, it basically picked a side. That means that the U.S. is probably not going to be the best positioned country to potentially mediate a toning down of the hostilities. That said, I think that there's we should be in for probably a prolonged conflict. I mean, there are no real easy solutions here. And we're getting to a point where really the only state actors per se were Israel and maybe the U.S., Egypt, and then non-state actors. Now we're moving into sort of a point where all the state actors are also having to take sides. What that's going to mean for voters 6 months down the road or a year down the road, I think that sort of remains a little bit unclear.
You're saying there's still time.
I think that there's still time. At the same time that, he's not in an optimal position with his base, Joe Biden, for the election strategy. Donald Trump, the most likely candidate from the right, also by criticizing Israel at a sort of particularly unfortunate time, it took a bit of a risk in terms of his own base. So I think that there's an extent to which to view this only as how many Arabs are in a certain place or how many Palestinians are in a certain place, and that's going to guide voting behavior, I think is not necessarily the right lens through which to view it, because there's a lot of factors in play. Central American Palestinians tend to be tremendously conservative. Chilean Palestinians, there's a lot of them, and there aren't that many Chileans, tend to not be. And they're reacting very differently as groups to what's happening right now in the Middle East. I think thinking that the United States won't have a similar amount of a sort of nuance in terms of their thinking, and that people are only going to vote based on ancestry is I think, giving people too little credit.
Elizabeth Dickinson?
Yeah, I think I would agree actually with what Daniel said exactly. I think there's a lot of diversity in these diasporas, and we have to remember that. I do think that, I think this is as you suggested, I think this could be a long conflict. And I think that the implications, both in the U.S. electoral situation, also here in Latin America, are frankly quite unpredictable. Because what we see right now is a situation that's extremely protracted. That even if the U.S. wanted to, with all of its diplomatic might, I'm not sure could reverse quickly or even chip away at the outsides. And so I think we have to be prepared to sort of weather this for the long haul, in the sense of watching how it affects the situation and how that impacts different leaders' electoral calculus.
The U.S. could do a lot more than chip away. If the U.S. decided to, the bombs would stop.
But they won't?
Apparently not. And more Palestinian kids are dying right now because of it.
All right. There are those who for decades have been trying to find the common ground. Take, for instance, the Eastern Devon Orchestra, founded nearly a quarter century ago by Latin American, Argentinian-born pianist and conductor Daniel Barenboim, and the late Palestinian-American intellectual Edward Said. To watch its young talents from across the divide, as I did in Berlin a couple of months back, is a sight to behold. In The Guardian, Daniel Barenboim issuing an appeal for peace, he says, this impulse to empathize with the situation of others is essential. Of course, and especially now, one must also allow for emotions such as fear, despair, and anger. But the moment this leads us to deny each other humanity, we are lost. Rhiannon Ryan, is it too much to hope that people see that point?
I don't think so. I also admire the Argentine-Israeli musician Daniel Barenboim, and I also had the chance of listening to this orchestra more than once or twice in Berlin. One of the things that impresses me most these days is the way Palestinian Israelis are behaving, are taking a position. Unlike in previous military operations of the IDF, of Israeli Defense Forces, the vast majority of Palestinian Israelis show support and solidarity with Jewish Israelis, which is something really admirable. And I think that in a way they could help and contribute to the beginning of one kind or another of dialogue between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. This is the key for the next phase.
Ron and Ryan, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Tel Aviv. I want to thank Elizabeth Dickinson for being with us from Bogota, Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez in Boston, Lex Paulson. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.